Bun găsit la emisiunea Știință și Cunoaștere. Continuăm de data trecută prezentarea unor noutăți de ultimă oră legate de reversul îmbătrânirii și vindecarea maladiei Alzheimer propuse de profesorul american Michael Fossel. Abordarea sa este unică și senzațională. Dacă va avea succes, atunci întreaga societate umană ar putea parcurge un salt calitativ. Domnia sa este în faza finală de verificare a toxicității tratamentului propus, iar această etapă se derulează de câteva luni în laboratoarele unui institut de cercetare din Spania, care este abilitat pentru experimente pe model animal. După finalizarea testelor, urmează obținerea aprobării FDA, forumul superior care reglementează siguranța tuturor produselor alimentare și medicamentoase pe teritoriul SUA. Conform celor discutate data trecută, această aprobare ar putea fi obținută în cursul anului 2019. Am reanalizat cu atenție discuția pe care am avut-o cu profesorul Fossel și am extras un rezumat pe care îl expun din nou pentru o mai bună înțelegere a detaliilor care le vom prezenta în minutele următoare. Boala Alzheimer se produce din cauze diferite care fac imposibile stabilirea unei reguli clare. Au fost detectate anumite gene a căror activare se corelează cu incidența bolii, dar, cu toate acestea, există indivizi care au gena Alzheimer, dar nu toți manifestă boala. Respectiv, există indivizi care nu au gena pentru Alzheimer, dar unii dintre ei manifestă boala. În plus, s-a mai descoperit o genă care este corelată cu o protecție crescută la Alzheimer. Însă, cu toate acestea, există indivizi care, deși au gena protectoare, totuși, unii dintre ei manifestă boala, iar alții care nu au gena protectoare nu manifestă boala. Din punct de vedere statistic, factorul de risc este mai mare la cei care nu au gena protectoare, respectiv la cei care au gena pentru Alzheimer. Însă, există suficient de multe excepții care fac imposibilă definirea unei reguli. Referitor la resetul telomeric și o posibilă incidență a cancerului, profesorul Fossel are o nouă teorie. Până nu de mult se credea că, dacă se produce prea multă telomerază sau este activată prea multă telomerază, atunci crește riscul de cancer. Ei bine, în majoritatea cazurilor este exact invers. Însă, cum spuneam mai devreme, nu există o regulă absolută. Ideea se bazează pe următoarea logică. Situația 1. Dacă telomerii sunt scurtați la maxim, atunci celulele nu se mai divid, indiferent dacă sunt celule canceroase sau normale. Iar în acest caz, acele celule, dacă au apucat să creeze o tumoare, aceasta nu mai crește și poate fi îndepărtată. S-a observat faptul că există celule canceroase care nu sunt capabile să-și autoreseteze telomerii. În acest caz, ele nu reprezintă un pericol, deoarece proliferarea s-a oprit. Celulele au devenit disfuncționale, dar nu mai produc creșteri tumorale. În această situație, chemoterapia este foarte eficientă și pacientul va supraviețui. Această informație poate salva vieți. Un simplu test al telomerelor poate stabili dacă chemoterapia va avea efectul scontat. Situația 2. Dacă celula are telomeri foarte lungi, atunci ea se va divide și totodată își va repara ADN-ul, ceea ce înseamnă că odată ce s-a produs acest reset telomeric, indiferent dacă e vorba de o celulă canceroasă sau o celulă normală, ea se poate autorepara, redevenind funcțională. În această situație, un reset complet al telomerilor, până la limita maximă admisibilă, va favoriza repararea ADN-ului, nu se vor mai produce mutații, iar la următoarea chemoterapie toate celulele disfuncționale vor fi eliminate și pacientul va supraviețui. Situația 3. Dacă o celulă are telomeri cu ceva mai mult decât limita minimă, ea înseamnă că mai are capacitatea de a se divide, însă în același timp ea nu își mai poate repara ADN-ul, iar în acest caz celula normală se divide cu erori, celula canceroasă suferă mutații și începe să se dividă necontrolat. Aceasta e situația cea mai nefavorabilă și din acest motiv asemenea celule devin rezistente și la chemoterapie. Invenția profesorului Fossel și noua sa abordare constă în trimiterea unui complex molecular format din o genă umană artificială și un promotor către celula țintă. Acesta intră în celulă, eliberează gena, stimulând crearea telomerazei, iar aceasta la rândul ei va produce resetul telomeric, dar la următoarea diviziune a celulei, gena umană artificială și promotorul se pierd. Procesul se estompează, iar celula își va utiliza telomerii noi primiți fără să se readauge alții la fiecare nouă diviziune. În felul acesta, cancerul este prevenit. Acesta este un proces natural de autolimitare. Vechea abordare cu activatorul genei deja existente în nucleu nu are un efect atât de profund și, la acea vreme, se suspecta riscul de cancer. Așadar, nu vă grăbiți să cumpărați tot felul de activatoare al căror efect este îndoielnic. Mitocondriile celulare nu îmbătrânesc, dar ele pot suferi avarii sau disfuncții tot datorită scurtării telomerilor din nucleul celulei. O mică parte din mitocondrii totuși îmbătrânesc, dar o mare parte din celulele somatice îmbătrânesc datorită scurtării telomerilor. În opoziție cu aceasta, celulele reproducătoare nu îmbătrânesc deloc, chiar primesc mai mulți telomeri, iar celulele stem îmbătrânesc foarte puțin. O altă informație interesantă este legată de faptul că avem și celule normale care nu se divid sau se divid foarte puțin, precum celulele mușchiului cardiac, neuronii și altele. Teoretic, ele nu ar avea motiv să sufere avarii, însă, datorită faptului că sunt dependente de alte celule care se divid rapid și îmbătrânesc, distrugerile apar în mod indirect. Astfel, o celulă neuronală suferă avarii datorită celulelor gliale adiacente. O celulă din miocard suferă avarii datorită celulelor sistemului arterial care le hrănește. Prin urmare, boala Alzheimer nu este consecința îmbătrânirii celulelor neuronale, ci a îmbătrânirii celulelor gliale. Așadar, abordarea profesorului Fossel este incitantă, interesantă și sper că va avea succes. Vă invit acum să vedeți partea a doua a interviului înregistrat recent pe internet. What is the difference between the telomeres of a cancer cell and the telomeres of a normal cell? Or what make them continuously reset in cancer cells and why they don't reset naturally in the normal cell?
Well, you're asking about cancer cells and telomeres. Let me first say that there are cancer cells that can't reset their telomeres. However, we don't see them clinically because they can't divide. And if a cancer cell can't divide, it's not a clinical cancer. It's simply a bad cell. It may be a cell that's got damage and is mutated, but as long as it doesn't divide, it's not much of a burden. It's certainly not much of a clinical problem. So we tend to look at cancer cells that continue to divide as what we think of as real cancer cells because they're a problem. Those cancer cells can reset their telomeres in a couple of ways. But even when they do so, they only reset it a little bit. It's not that they make big, long telomeres and go back to normal. They reset it just enough to allow them to continue to divide, and in that case, you find they don't continue to repair their DNA. So they're at high risk. Cancer cells that reset telomeres just a little bit are at high risk of continued DNA damage, which means they can mutate, they can become resistant, for example, to chemotherapy. If we can reset telomeres completely, what you find is you minimize the damage of the risk of continual damage, continual mutation. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a patient with a breast cancer and that it right now is not resistant to chemotherapy. If I take that patient and reset telomeres just a tiny bit, which is what happens normally in cancer, she'll continue to grow breast cancer cells and they will continue to mutate and they'll become resistant. So she will die of breast cancer. If I take that same patient, however, and I reset telomeres completely, the potential is that I will improve DNA repair, and therefore the cell will no longer gain continued mutations. So now it's not resistant to the next chemotherapy I use, and the patient can survive chemotherapy. So there's a big difference here. It really matters that we get the telomere to the point where it not only allows cells to divide, but increases the rate of cell repair, DNA repair within that cell. That's the critical part of cancer cells and telomerase. It is not that telomerase causes cancer, is that if you have just a little bit of telomerase, you can have a cancer. If you have enough telomerase, you may be able to prevent continued problems.
But how is it possible that these cells maintain a good length telomeres all the time?
You say, how is it possible that these cells maintain good length telomeres all the time? Which cells you mean?
Yes, cancer cells.
Well, cancer cells don't maintain good telomere lengths all the time. In fact, what they do is they maintain relatively short telomeres in general. That is, probably something in excess of 90% of cancer cells express telomerase but they don't usually have big long telomeres. They have long telomeres just long enough to permit cell division, but not long enough to increase cell repair. So they're not good telomere lengths. They're sort of bad telomere lengths. In fact, it's the worst possible case.
So the sperm and ova do have the enzyme which activate the gene expression in order to maintain the telomere length?
Yes, sperm and ova, the reproductive cells, have an enzyme, telomerase, normal human enzyme, that activates gene expression. Or put it differently, it re-extends telomere lengths, which controls or modulates gene expression to have optimal cell function. For example, the mitochondria.
Please tell us what other cells are capable of having or creating telomerase enzyme. Stem cells from the bone marrow, for example.
Yeah, you're asking, we know that the reproductive cells can express telomerase, maintain telomere length, and effectively be immortal, and that most somatic cells, most body cells, don't express telomerase. But in between, there are stem cells. And some stem cells express telomerase to varying degrees. So, for example, if I'm looking at stem cells in the bone marrow, what you find is, here's a stem cell within the bone marrow, and it's capable of creating red cells, white cells, other blood cells, all right? And if I look at that cell, I find there's no telomerase in it. But now I stimulate it. I say, we're running a little low on red cells. We need more red cells. Please divide so we can create more red cells. Just before it divides, it re-expresses telomerase because it's been stimulated to do so. Re-expresses telomerase, resets telomere length, and then it divides into two cells. One of those cells continues to be a stem cell, and again, if it's stimulated, it'll express telomerase. The other one begins to divide and create red cells. This cell will never again create telomerase. So when it's stimulated, it can create just enough telomerase to mostly maintain telomere length, whereas one of the daughter cells won't. One of the daughter cells will continue to be a stem cell. But even in that case, you find that the telomere length isn't quite normal. It just isn't quite as much shorter as other somatic cells, other body cells, which is why if I look at this stem cell in my bone marrow in a 100-year-old patient, the telomeres are a lot shorter than they are in the ova and sperm cells, but they're not nearly as short as they are, for example, in skin cells. So it has maintained a lot of the telomere length pretty well, enough so that you can continue to make red and white blood cells at age 105, but not as well as the germ cell and the sperm cells do.
Please tell us about other very few tissues where the telomerase enzyme is still produced. For example, the endometrium.
There's a lot we don't know about this. For example, as it turns out, what about the cells not only in the endometrium, but the cells that surround the sperm, the Sertoli cells, for example, or the ova that surround the oval tissue and that support these tissues. Some of them may can express telomerase, like some stem cells do, like the sperm and ova do, and some don't. What you find is that it probably depends on their function. That is, the endometrium needs to express telomerase so it can support a lot of cell growth very quickly without becoming degenerate or senescent or old. But it doesn't need to do it for years. It just needs to do it, for example, for 9 months. Other cells, for example, in your bone marrow, need to express just enough to keep you going as long as you could possibly live. And the sperm and ova need to express enough to maintain your offspring so that they're normal. You're not born with a child who's already 70 years old biologically. So it very much depends on which tissue you're looking at. There's an awful lot we don't know about it, but what we do know about it suggests that it's a very functional answer. Whatever is most functional that's going to create a normal offspring or allow you to live a normal life is there, but there are limits in the body's cells.
This paper is quoting a group of Japanese authors. Interestingly, the endometrium is one of the few adult tissues that expresses high levels of telomerase.
Well, what the paper is saying is that the endometrial cells express telomerase, and this doesn't surprise me, but I don't know the data. Again, it would seem to me to be consistent with what I would expect in normal biological function, but not my data, I don't know it.
But why the other human cells do not express this enzyme while the endometrium is capable of producing it? However, the menstrual cycles make this tissue to be lost every single month.
I see the initial question you're asking about why other cells do not express the enzyme telomerase, but I'm not sure what you're asking about menstrual cycle and menstrual tissue.
the tissue is lost. The tissue is lost on most cases in order to be rebuilt in the next month and so on.
Well, again, that makes sense. What you want to do is you want to be able to continue to create endometrial tissue for a potential normal pregnancy throughout the woman's normal reproductive life. So, for example, for 45 years or something, or during the reproductive period, for example, from age, say, 10 to 40 or 50, that period you need to be able to produce perfectly normal tissue throughout. You do not want to make it so that at age 40 she's more likely to give birth to an older child. You want each case the child to be a normal neonate, if possible. So biologically, it makes sense that you'd want the optimal endometrial tissue in every single period. Once a month, you want normal tissue. You want not tissue that's aged. So again, it makes sense biologically to do that. You raise another issue, though, about why other cells don't express this enzyme, and that gets us into sort of teleologic issues of evolution. Why is it that you would want human beings to age at all? That gets very interesting and very complex, but very hard to prove.
So in theory, the human genes could have the possibility to express the one to make the enzyme, but they just don't express it by default. And your discovery aimed to surpass this lack of gene expression.
You're saying in general, the human chromosomes, the human cells don't express telomerase enzyme. The germ cells, the reproductive cells, do express it by default. The normal body cells don't express it by default, and the stem cells are in between. And what we're doing is we are simply bypassing the block on this normal enzyme in the body's normal somatic tissues to make them act young and functional again.
So it is like driving a car and you wish to surpass the brake?
Actually, maybe not. Maybe a better analogy would be the gas tank. What we're saying is that most of the time, if I go drive a car, perhaps I can go several hundred miles or several hundred kilometers, but then I run out of gas. And what we're saying is, what we're going to do is refill the gas tank.
There are scientific papers who present the fact that the human reproductive cells are getting more telomeres while the body is aging. In the healthy individuals, of course. But that means these cells do have a lot of telomerase enzyme. Why?
You're asking the same question that you've asked before. You're saying that human reproductive cells generally have more telomere length or express telomerase in healthy people. And it does mean that those cells have access to telomerase. They can re-express telomerase, reset telomeres. And you're asking why, and the answer is obvious, which is if the germ cell line, for example, the ova and sperm, didn't express telomerase, human beings wouldn't be here. We would have aged 3.5 billion years ago, and there wouldn't be life on this planet. The fact that there's life on this planet shows us that the reproductive tissues are capable of expressing telomerase and maintaining young normal cells. But the other question, the opposite question, is sort of more interesting, which is why don't the rest of your cells express telomerase? And as I say, that gets us into sort of interesting evolutionary questions. And I think it has to do with the ability of a species to adapt. If a species is too long-lived, it can't adapt to environmental changes. Environmental changes go on all the time, whether it's in terms of your prey, what you eat, your predators who eat you, or the changes in the geology or the atmosphere. Over the span of existence of the Earth, the oxygen levels on this planet have varied enormously to points where there was no oxygen, to points where there were higher oxygen. Likewise, the carbon dioxide. Likewise, the acidity of the oceans. Likewise, the temperature of the planet have gone up and down. And if you have a species that is got too long a life, it can't adapt quickly. Bacteria have a very short lifespan. They adapt to almost anything. You change things, you add penicillin to the culture, you do anything, and a certain number of cells will adapt. A certain number of bacteria will adapt to it and change. Human beings have a long lifespan. We can adapt, but it takes us tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years to adapt in an evolutionary sense, whereas bacteria do it in a matter of hours. So, the more rapidly the environment changes, the more you want to have a short lifespan. If the environment is stable or relatively stable, you can afford to have a long lifespan in a species that sticks around for a long time. human beings in general, I mean, never mind the minor ice ages and the major ice ages that human beings have evolved over the last hundreds, thousands of years, but human beings in general have had a relatively stable environment, and we have the good fortune to be able to have a relatively long lifespan. But again, it's a balance. Too long a lifespan, you can't adapt. Too short a lifespan, and you have species that can't, for example, pass on cultural knowledge.
Very interesting, very interesting.
Well, another example of this would be the dinosaurs. You know, if you think about what happened 65 million years ago when we were hit by a major asteroid, it was not the smallest animals on Earth that died with the shortest lifespans. It was the bigger animals with the longer lifespans that died off. It was the huge dinosaurs. Prior to that, you could have huge animals in the land and the sea and the air that probably had very long lifespans, but they were not capable of adapting quickly. Whereas, again, bacteria, the very small mammals, were capable of changing their diet, changing their behaviors quickly because they had short lifespans. So they managed to make it through, more or less, the cataclysmic environment change of the asteroid, but not the big animals.
Yes, they are too large and have too many cells, too complex systems, and this is very logic.
If you think about what happened in the New World, the Americas, when human beings first came across from Asia, they changed the environment a great deal in terms of predation. That is, they began to go after bison, they went after saber-toothed tigers, they went after mammoths, and some of those animals, notably the mammoths, died out. And they died out because they were not able to adapt rapidly to predation changes. But what you didn't find is that the rabbits didn't die out. They were smaller, they could adapt faster, change their behavior, and get away from hunters faster than could mammoths, who took a long time to make changes in the way that they responded to predation. Same has been true throughout the world. You know, most of the species that we end up causing extinction for are ones that can't adapt fast enough to what we do to them, whether it was the dodo or whether it was the mammoth. These species are not capable of adapting fast enough. We have yet to cause extinction in bacterial species. Why? Because they can adapt so fast that even when we come up with a new antibiotic, they will adapt to it within a matter of days, weeks, months, years. That's not true of dodos, mammoths, saber-toothed tigers. They can't adapt fast enough.
Please explain this drawing about telomere loop.
You're showing me a picture of the way that telomere loops work. And all I can say is that it has not a lot of bearing on what I will be doing. It's certainly not my area. What it boils down to, though, is that at the end of the telomere, rather than just have two strands of chromosomes that are extended or being shortened either way, they are tucked over in such a way that you can't see the end part. So the end part is not exposed, it's not open to damage. They're tucked over and sheltered, hence the sheltering complex proteins, so-called, to prevent the body from having damage to the telomeres any more than it can help. Your telomeres shorten every time cells divide, if you don't have telomerase, but you can't afford to simply have them being damaged because they're exposed. So they're sheltered. They're tucked into loops.
Please explain the next drawing about telomere activity.
Yes, this is what you're looking at is a graph sort of telomere length over time.
Yes.
So telomere length increases during gestation, and the baby has fairly long telomeres throughout most of its cells. But as time goes by, what you find is that the reproductive cells are able to maintain telomere length, whereas stem cells slowly shortened, and the cancer cells, the somatic cells shorten relatively quickly.
Yes.
Hence, we get wrinkles and heart disease. Cancer cells go up a little bit, but not very much. So that's exactly the sort of thing we've been discussing for the past hour.
Okay, but there is something about reproductive cells on the graph.
Notice something really interesting there, though. Notice that the sperm cells, the length goes up slightly over time.
Yes. That was interesting.
Yeah, and the reason that probably is, again, this is teleology, this is evolution, it's hard to do experiments on it. But the reason that probably is occurring is because it's what I was saying before. If you have a stable environment, you can afford to have a longer lifespan individual. So what you find is that if your father, for example, lived into their 90s, that implies there's a stable environment. If your father died at age 20, that implies there's probably an unstable environment. If you have malnutrition, wars, environmental changes, increased predation, you'll tend to die young. Whereas if you have a stable culture, a stable society, stable access to food and shelter, you'll tend to live longer. So what you're finding is that biology is arranged in such a way that if the environment is stable, that is, if your father tended to live a long time, you will tend to be born with longer telomeres, and so you'll probably have a longer lifespan. That makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If your father died young, so maybe you were conceived when he was 19, but your father died at age 20, that implies that the lifespan of the individual has been cut short because of a stressful environment for whatever reason. And therefore, you want a shorter lifespan, a shorter turnaround time, so that the species can continue to adapt more quickly. So yes, it helps to have a short lifespan if there's a lot of stress. It helps to have a longer lifespan if there's not a lot of stress. And that's what you're seeing there. Again, that does not prove that that's the rationale for it. This is all teleology. But it makes sense biologically.
Please explain this graph regarding telomerase activity in the endometrium.
Oh, now again, you're looking at what looks like menstrual cycle questions.
Yes.
Is that where we are? Okay. These are endometrial tissues or?
Yes, and the telomerase became negative, positive. What does that mean?
As I see your graph, what I'm seeing is that as the endometrium and the reproductive system of the woman prepares for a potential pregnancy, you increase the telomerase because, again, you want to have a normal baby. If you get to the point where there has been no fertilization, then none of that tissue matters anymore, hence menstrual flow. And what you find is that it no longer expresses telomerase.
Please explain this abstract and simplify for my understanding. And I quote, "Longer telomeres in the somatic cells of an individual have been regarded as a marker of youth and biological fitness within a population. Yet several research groups have reported the surprising findings of longer telomeres in the germ cells of older men, which translated into longer leukocyte telomere length in their offspring. Although all these studies were purely cross-sectional, a longitudinal trend in the aging tests of individual males was taken for granted."
Well, this is a very confusingly written abstract. Not very clear, I grant you. Part of what they're commenting on is what I just discussed, which is a lot of people have assumed that telomere length in sperm cells would be either maintained or would shorten over time, so that older men would have shorter telomeres, or the same as they did when they were young. And what you find is instead, the telomeres actually increase in the older male. And as I just said, biologically speaking, from a broader evolutionary perspective, that's what I would expect. I would expect that older men would have slightly longer telomeres in their sperm cells, because that's an indicator of low stress. That is, the individual lived for a long time. So I'm not surprised by this. The author plainly was surprised. On the other hand, he's also reporting something in the second half of this paragraph that I have a very hard time understanding. The wording is confusing to me. I'm not sure what they're asking about.
Well, for me also was difficult to understand what are they saying there. And now I have one more graph, and please explain telomere stabilization after critical senescence.
What the graph here is saying is that germ cell lines, for example, again, ovum and sperm, the reproductive cells, maintain their telomere length pretty well. Again, never mind some of the details, but they maintain their telomere length. And that in general, the somatic cells continue downhill and become more and more senescent. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Stem cells are in between germ cells and somatic cells. And if I were to put in a telomerase gene, which is what we're going to do in our Alzheimer's patients, they go back essentially to the germ cell level. So you can improve or cure senescence by using H-TERT transduced cells. That's what we're going to do to our clinical patients. Now, if I go back to the somatic cells, though, what you find is that there are some interesting details that are pretty technical. And it has to do with the fact that as the cells become senescent, they begin to have some abnormalities. And they normally would stop dividing early, but they can manage to bypass that by, in this case, abrogating what's called P53. It's a cell cycle braking system. It's like your brakes of your car, in a sense. They bypass the brakes, and they continue until they essentially run out of gas. That's crisis. And then what you find is if you could activate a little bit of telomerase in that level, you could maintain the telomeres as cancer cells do, but still not go back to normal. So if you have just enough telomerase, those cells will continue to divide, and they have stable telomeres, but they don't have stable DNA, so they continue to mutate, so you get resistant cancers. That's where that bottom of that graph is going. But again, up a little bit where it says H-TERT transduced cells, that's what we'll be doing. What we're going to do is take patients who have senescent cells in their brain, reset them to normal young cells, and they should act like normal germ cells or normal young cells in the body. Much better approach.
I can't follow exactly. Please explain what is telomere stabilization.
Well, yes, that's the danger. Now, most cells, when they hit crisis phase, simply do not divide. And they're not cancerous. They're just old cells. They're not very functional. In fact, they create problems for the tissue. But they're just sitting there. Think of them as sort of sociopathic cells, like a very unpleasant neighbor. And they're not actively doing much to you, but you don't like them very much. They're very unpleasant. On the other hand, if I activate just enough telomerase, I can turn them into very actively unpleasant terrorists, in a sense, cancer cells. Okay? But normal cells, as they come down that hill, first they approach senescence, and at that stage, they manage to bypass the brakes and go on to become, as I say, sociopathic cells. Very unpleasant neighbors, but not terrorists. But if they can get just enough telomerase going that they can continue to go out and create problems, then they are terrorist cells. They're cancer cells. So that's what's going on. M1 is officially senescence, but those cells can continue, even though they're not acting normally, they can bypass the brakes, continue to divide till they hit crisis, and then they either stop dividing altogether, as I say, a very unpleasant neighbor, but they're not causing damage to you, or they can have a slight amount of telomerase activated, in which case they're not only unpleasant neighbors, but they're dangerous neighbors. So that's what's happening with somatic cells.
Please explain what is M1 and M2 when the senescence of the cell is manifesting, and if the cell don't die, then it goes to a critical phase, and after the crisis phase, the cell may reactivate the telomeres. And what is transduced cells?
Yeah, let me put this in context. The whole line going downhill, the somatic cell line, before it gets to M1, those are still, in a sense, senescing cells. And those are the ones we're most concerned about. Those are the cells that are not doing their job. They're not officially senescent, nor are they in crisis, but they're not normal. They're not acting normal. They're not taking care of the normal cell functions, like mitochondria, free radicals, and DNA repair. They're slowly becoming worse and worse at what they're doing. And those are the cells that ultimately are causing, for example, Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease. And those are the cells that we can transduce by putting in a gene therapy with an H-TERT gene. That H-TERT represents a normal human gene. We just put that in, ask them to please express telomerase, and that line that then goes straight back uphill is what our animals do in mice, for example, what we predicted we can do in humans, and what we're about to do in human trials next year.
When is it best to act? Before the point M1?
Yes, very much so. Let me give you another example of something somebody's tried. Some people have suggested what we should do is take those senescent cells down there at crisis that are very unpleasant neighbors and remove them all. They're suggesting that when you have unpleasant neighbors, you should simply put them in jail, in a sense, take them out of the neighborhood. The problem with doing that is that you need a certain number of cells, for example, in your coronary arteries or in your knee joint. You need cells there. So if you remove those senescent cells, all the cells that are still upstream from M1, they're still up that slope a little bit, will now have to divide more to replace the missing cells. So all you've done is accelerated the rate of aging.
Please explain what is tetrahymena-telomerase and why this one is needed for telomere repeat synthesis.
You asked about tetrahymena. Tetrahymena is an organism that is essentially immortal when it expresses telomerase. And their telomerase is, in most respects, no different than yours or mine. The actual sequence of bases is a tiny bit different than yours and mine, but the function is the same. It's telomerase that allows tetrahymena to continue to be functional. If they didn't express telomerase, they would age very quickly.
And this is useful in anti-aging research?
Well, not really. It's just another part of the puzzle. It's useful in the academic sense to understand this, but it's not useful in the clinical sense. It's, you know, it's like in trying to cure polio, I don't need to understand the polio virus. I need to be able to create a vaccine. So understanding tetrahymena telomerase is very interesting academically, like trying to understand the polio virus and how it's put together. But really what we need clinically is a vaccine for polio, or in this case, a gene therapy for Alzheimer's disease. So interesting academically, not all that useful clinically.
One last question. Please explain the next abstract, and I quote, "Understanding the regulation and limitation of the telomerase enzyme holds the promise of reversing telomere shortening and cellular aging with the potential to extend human lifespan and improve the health and wellness of elderly individuals. Research from the laboratory of Chan and his colleagues Yin-Yan Chen, Joshua Podvleski, and Chenungen Logan-Svaran recently uncovered a crucial step in the telomerase catalytic cycles that limits the ability of telomerase to synthesize telomeric DNA repeats onto chromosome ends. Telomerase has a built-in braking system to ensure precise synthesis of correct telomeric DNA repeats. This safeguarding brake, however, also limiting the overall activity of the telomerase enzyme, said Professor Chen. Finding a way to properly release the brakes on the telomerase enzyme has the potential to restore the lost telomere length of an adult cell, stem cells, and to even reverse cellular aging itself."
Good, yes. This is what I was talking about earlier in this talk. What this article is talking about is the fact that there is a self-limit to how far you extend telomeres. So let's say that the normal telomere length were 20 base pairs. And over time, it shortens to 15 base pairs and 12 base pairs and 10 base pairs and 8 base pairs and becomes senescent. Now, say that I go in with telomerase and I put a little telomerase in and I move it back up to 20. What if I put in twice as much telomerase? Would it move up to 30 base pairs? And the answer is no, because there's a built-in feedback mechanism that prevents the telomere from getting too long. And there are a number of reasons why that's useful. But from a practical perspective, a clinical perspective, it's nice to know it's there. So if I took a cell with 12 kilobase pairs, another one with 15 kilobase pairs, another one with 8 kilobase pairs, and I gave them all a big burst of telomerase, they all might go back to 20 kilobase pairs, but none of them would go back to 22 base pairs, or 30 base pairs, or 100 base pairs. They go back to their normal upper limit because there's a built-in limit on how far it'll go, which is good.
Before we end, please read for our viewers the entire post from your blog entitled "Big Pharma Still Looking for the Horse."
Well, this is a quote from my blog, and what it says is, it's called "Big Pharma Still Looking for the Horse." And I tell a story. I say about a century ago in a small American town, the very first automobile chugged to a stop in front of the general store. And a local man stared at it in disbelief and said, "Where's the horse?" And then the driver gave a long explanation involving internal combustion, pistons, gasoline, drive shafts, and explained how the car worked. The local old man listened very politely, but he was increasingly frustrated. And he finally broke off the explanation. He said, "Look, I get all that. I understand what you said about the engine and the gas, but I still want to know, where's your horse?" The problem is, people think they understand it, but they often still are asking for the horse. And when you've got a car, there is no horse. You're missing the point of it. And this is what's going on with Big Pharma. I said, about 3 hours before I wrote that, I was in a teleconference with a major global pharmaceutical company, one that we've all heard of. And I was invited to talk about telomerase therapy and why it might work for Alzheimer's. And I pointed out it doesn't actually lower beta amyloid levels. It just increases the rate of turnover so that you get more normal beta amyloid function and fewer damaged molecules. And I explained about senescent gene expression, dynamic protein pools, and recycling slows significantly as we get older. And that causes a secondary increase in amyloid plaque, tau tangles, and mitochondrial dysfunction. And the pharmaceutical executive, very nice woman, listened, not very politely, but with increasing frustration. And she finally broke in on my explanation. She said, "Look, I get all that, but what I still want to know is, how does telomerase lower beta amyloid levels?" In short, she still wanted to know where I hid the horse. Because telomerase doesn't lower beta amyloid. It increases the recycling rate of beta amyloid, and the result is fewer damaged molecules. She didn't get that. By the way, she was the chief scientist in charge of a major clinical trial trying to pull beta amyloid out of patients with Alzheimer's disease. and it didn't work. And my answer is, that's why it doesn't work, because you're still looking for a horse, and I'm saying it's not the horse, there's internal combustion engine. So the global pharmaceutical company invited me to talk with them had earlier this year given up on its experimental Alzheimer's drug that aimed at lowering beta amyloid levels since it had no effect on the clinical course, none. And they have so far wasted several years and several $100 million chasing after beta amyloid levels. And now, as judged by our conversation, they're still intent on wasting more time and money chasing amyloid levels. In short, they're still looking for the horse. We offered them a chance to ignore beta amyloid levels and simply correct the underlying problem. While not changing the amyloid levels, we can clean up the beta amyloid plaque as well as the tau tangles, the mitochondrial dysfunction, and all the other biomarkers of Alzheimer's. More importantly, we can almost certainly improve the clinical course and largely reverse the cognitive decline. In short, we have a new car in town. It doesn't have a horse. As with so many other big pharmaceutical companies, this company is so focused on biomarkers that they can't focus on what those markers imply in terms of the dynamic pathology and the altered protein turnover that underlies age-related disease, including Alzheimer's disease. And we wonder why all these drug trials continue to fail. Who asked about beta amyloid levels is intelligent and experienced, but she's wedded to an outmoded model that has thus far shown no financial reward, and worse yet, no clinical validity. It doesn't work. Yet this executive met with me as part of a group seeking innovative approaches to treating Alzheimer's disease. Their vision is that they're looking for innovation. The reality is they're still looking for a horse. It's as though she's a very, very bright woman who is very, very focused on how to improve horse genetics. But we don't have a horse. We've got a much better approach. It's more effective.
Dear Professor Michael Fossel, I am immensely grateful for this special edition interview and hope to record the new one in autumn later this year. I'll select topics from your blog and I'll then illustrate them for the new interview.
That sounds good. I look forward to it, Kristen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
În completare, vă propun să revedem un film produs de profesorul american Bruce Lipton legat de funcționarea creierului, rolul celulelor gliale și de ce noi folosim creierul în proporție de 100% și nu 10% cum se menționa într-un mit modern. Reportajul următor completează foarte bine întreaga discuție pe care am avut-o cu profesorul Fossel.
Hi, dear friends, cultural creatives, and imaginal selves everywhere. Bruce back. And this month's newsletter, I really want to focus on something called an urban myth. And this particular urban myth is the belief that we only operate off of 10% of our brain. So we've all heard that, yes, we're only using 10% of our brain. And boy, if we could use all the rest of it, we'd be super smart. But hey, that's all we use. Firstly, where did that number come from, 10%? A long time ago, when putting the body together through an understanding of histology and the cells that make up organs, a study of the brain revealed one very important fact, and that is only 10% of the brain was made up of neurons. 90% of the cells in the brain were not neurons, but they were called supporting or connective tissue and given the name glial cells. Well, what's really interesting about that is in the neuron principle, the neuron doctrine, it was believed that the neurons were the functional cells of the brain and the glial cells were more or less just support. Well, then by definition right away it says then you're only using 10% of your brain because that's all that the neurons comprise in the brain, 10%. For a long time, the glial cells, again, were thought to be just like connective tissue support physically and nutritionally the neurons. But over the last number of decades, what we started to find is this: there was a misunderstanding about glial cells. That glial cells are a lot more important in neural function than just physical support. Glial cells can inhibit or activate neurons. Glial cells connect to neurons. Glial cells can control the activity of neurons. So all of a sudden, these glial cells, which were looked at as just passive cells in the brain, turn out to be actually quite functional in integrating the nature of how the brain works. In a way of looking at it, in a simple analogy, consider that the neurons are nouns in a sentence. and that the glial cells are the verbs and the adjectives and the adverbs, the modifiers of all the nouns. So the glial cells create a fulfillment of a picture. So neurons are like a stick figure, and when you add the glial cells, you fill out the nature of the whole human. So glial cells become a very functional, integrated part of all neuronal activity. So the concept of the neuron doctrine that said only neurons are involved with functioning in the nervous system, it turns out the glial cells are as well. So now we're not dealing with 10% of the brain, we're dealing with 100% of the brain. Yes, you have access to 100% of your brain all of the time. But does that mean that we actually use the whole brain all of the time? And the answer is no. Because what we start to find out is when we start to live in patterns and in habits, that what happens is we just activate certain neuronal pathways that are habitual pathways. And as a result, these are the pathways that have preference in our everyday life. But if you can engage whole brain activity, you can enhance your consciousness and your awareness and your ability to control your life. So basically it says that we can become whole brain when we start to think holistically, instead of just playing recurrent programs that play over and over again and activate the same pathways. So the relevance is that once we start to engage in whole brain activity, we enhance our ability as humans on this planet. And now we're beginning to find out there are many different ways to engage and activate the whole brain. Some of them involve simple exercises such as something called brain gym. And brain gym is a very interesting exercise of the body and the nervous system integration in this way. My right hand is controlled by my left hemisphere. My left hand is controlled by my right hemisphere. But here's an interesting story. If my right hand, controlled by my left hemisphere, crosses the midline, then it simultaneously gets picked up by the other hemisphere, because now it's in that territory as well. So when you cross your arms and when you cross your legs, what you're doing is causing the right and the left hemispheres to work together in harmony. When we are activating brain synchronization, where right and left hemispheres are engaged together simultaneously, it activates something like superlearning. With both hemispheres working together, we have much more superior characteristics of neural function. However, after age 7 and 8, we start to express what is called brain dominance, meaning during the day, we don't have synchronization of both hemispheres. During the day, it's like a wave form. Sometimes we're more in the left hemisphere, sometimes we're more in the right, then it comes back to the left and back to the right, so that we're cycling through one hemisphere at a time. This is called brain dominance, where one hemisphere is dominant over the other hemisphere. Well, the relevance about that is integrating our lives is very difficult in brain dominance for a simple reason. As been suggested, our left hemisphere is based on logic and details. Our right hemisphere is actually associated with emotions and wholeness. And this becomes very important, because if you're only looking with your left hemisphere, then all the logic things make sense, but there's no emotional component to it. And reverse, if you're in the right hemisphere, you get emotionally tied up, but the logic drops out. Well, this happens to us ever since the time we were 8 through our adult life. If you can get both hemispheres to be in sync, hemisync, then you're engaging logic and emotions at the same time. That opens up a window for super learning opportunities where you can download information very, very quickly and very fast, but it also opens up a whole wide range of thinking that includes an emotional component as well as an intellectual component, which is necessary to fulfill a whole picture. So if you're operating from brain dominance, you're actually shutting off one component of your nervous system at that time. So if you do an exercise like brain gym, where you're involved with crossing your arms and your legs, when you do that, you start to integrate both. Very interestingly, when we have hemisync, we're much more calm, collected, and able to really express neurological functions that are very fully supporting of ourselves. And this is why it's very interesting when you go home and relax at night, sometimes you find yourself with your ankles crossed over each other just sitting in your chair. without even knowing what you're doing, by crossing your ankles, you're actually engaging a whole brain process. So if you're stressed, for example, during the day, or you just want to relax when you go home at night, crossing your arms and legs actually engages both hemispheres, which calms the system down, but engages a whole brain process. So you become much more effective in your relaxed state. So if you're having a tough moment during the day, just take a moment and cross your arms and legs. Hold them together and just wait for about 3 or 4 minutes, and you'll start to feel a calmness overcome. And in this calmness, your neurological functions will be totally enhanced. When we start to operate from patterns that are replayed every day, we start to express very specific pathways that are reused over and over and over again. And as a result, we actually shut down a large amount of functioning of the brain and just go through the habit, the patterns that replay themselves over and over again. So basically, what you really have to understand is this: we can use 100% of the brain, but if we play the same patterns over and over again, we don't need to use 100% of the brain. So, simple point, I'd just like to suggest that once you start to recognize that you can have hemisync, where you can get right and left hemispheres to engage together and stay conscious, you are using 100% of your brain activity. And when you do that, you'll also find that your life is easier, more harmonious, and healthier. Because when you're using your full nervous system, it will support your life and enhance your growth. And this becomes important. So don't get stuck that I'm only using 10% of my brain. That story is false. You can use 100%, and it's available to us. And basically all you have to understand is this: stay conscious, stay mindful, and stop playing the same patterns over and over again, because that opens up an opportunity to create new behavior when you stop playing the programs.
Așadar, știința avansează, dar cu toate acestea mulți oameni cred în mituri. Ca și concluzie la ceea ce am prezentat în cadrul interviului cu profesorul Fossel, tot ce se poate spune până în prezent este că abordarea domniei sale deranjează anumite firme producătoare de medicamente, în special cele pentru Alzheimer, deși se știe faptul că nu vindecă boala și nici măcar nu încetinește evoluția ei. Acest lucru are însă o latură optimistă, și anume, cu atât mai mult abordarea profesorului Fossel ar putea avea șanse reale de succes, deoarece firmele de medicamente se simt amenințate. Dacă ideile sale ar fi simple speculații lipsite de suport științific, atunci nimeni n-ar avea nicio îngrijorare. Terapia genetică împreună cu medicina personalizată reprezintă elementele esențiale ale unei noi viziuni în domeniul sănătății și o nouă revoluție în știința medicală. Până la următoarea întâlnire cu profesorul Fossel, vă propun să păstrăm speranța vie a unei soluții care ar putea eradica maladia Alzheimer pentru totdeauna. Fiți alături de noi data viitoare la o nouă întâlnire cu știință și cunoaștere.